Over the past month, I've been using and testing a bunch of different weed pullers. So I put together a spreadsheet. I got some categories together for things that I can test. And I think I have a pretty definitive winner for all of the weed pullers I have tested. Before I show you all the tests I ran, let's walk through the spreadsheet so you can understand how I did the scoring. Here are the 5 brands of weed pullers that I tested. Now I do want to point out some of these were sent to me to review. Some of these I purchased, some of these I borrowed, but no one is asking me to do a comparison test like this. This I'm doing on my own because I want to know which one is the best. So how I put the spreadsheet together, I have a bunch of different features or tests, and I assigned a score 1 to 10 for each feature, 1 being the lowest, 10 being the best. But I've also assigned value or weight to each score. So if a feature really isn't that important, it has a lower value or weight. And for the more important things, it has a higher value or weight. The first thing I want to talk about are the dimensions. While I don't think the height and weight are incredibly important, they do have some importance. As far as the height goes, this BracNova ended up being the tallest. Now, because it's tall and it's a lever, it means you don't have to use as much force pushing the handle over. But if I'm being honest, after having used all of these weed pullers, I don't think the height really makes that much of a difference. The weight, on the other hand, I think makes a slightly bigger difference. The Grootpow and the BracNova ended up being the heaviest. I think the reason for that is the design and the material these are made of. I think they're made of stainless steel. They're very strong, very good construction, but that does come at a cost of the weight. The Grampa's weeder, the Fiskars, and the Fiskars all ended up being quite lightweight. And for me personally, I didn't really notice the difference that much with weight, but as I switched off between the two, I let other people use my weeders and they all commented when using a more lightweight one, how lightweight it is. So it's certainly something to consider. The next thing I want to talk about is the handle. So if you'll notice with the Grootpow and the Fiskars, on the top it kind of has this handle that you can use to either hold onto it or push down. Before a few weeks ago, I would have thought this doesn't really matter, but I ended up injuring my leg a few weeks ago and I can't use my dominant leg right now. And so when I've been doing my weeding, instead of stepping down on the weeder, I have to kind of use my arms to push it down. The Fiskars and the Grootpow make this really easy because of the handle on top. The other weed pullers just have the pole, so you kind of have to stick it in the best you can. Again, I don't think this is incredibly important, but it's certainly something to be aware of. One of the tests I did is with the pulling angle, and what I mean by this is when you put the weed puller in the ground, you first have to stick it in the ground and then you kind of pull it down. And with the weed pullers, you have to pull it a little ways before it kind of clamps onto the weed. So for this test, I put all of the weed pullers in the ground vertically, and then I pushed it over just until it got to the point where I could feel the resistance from it pulling the weed up. And surprisingly, with the Fiskars, you can see it looks basically vertical. So almost immediately after putting it in the ground, it's ready to pull the weed out. With the Grootpow, the Fiskars, and the BracNova, you have to push it over a little ways before it actually grabs the weed. This is another thing I didn't really notice at first until I kind of switched between the different weed pullers and noticed that on some I had to push it down a lot further before it would get the weed out. But the Grandpa's weeder and the Fiskars, once you push it in the ground and start pulling it down, the weed instantly comes out. So a little bit more important, especially if you're doing a lot of weeding. Not all weed pullers have the ejector. What the ejector is after you've pulled the weed up, some of the weed pullers will have this kind of like plastic handle where you can push the weed out. After using all of these weed pullers, I'm gonna say I wouldn't even consider getting a weed puller if it doesn't have the ejector. It makes that big of a difference for me. For example, the Grandpa's weeder, it does a great job pulling the weed out of the ground, but when you want to remove the weed from the weed puller, I tried shaking it. Sometimes that works, a lot of times it doesn't. Probably most times it doesn't. So you have to get your hand, pull the weed out, or what I like to do is I'll just put the weed puller on the ground, step on the weed with my foot, and then remove the weed puller. It's not a huge deal, but it certainly is an extra step. So if you're looking to get a weed puller and you plan on doing a lot of weeding, definitely keep the ejector in mind. I was really impressed with the Fiskars ejector. To me, that was the smoothest and easiest. You just push it, the weed comes right out, works really well. As far as consistency goes, what I mean by this is after you pull out like 10, 20, 30 weeds, how many times does it take you to get the full weed out? So there's some weed pullers where every time you put it in, it takes the whole weed out. And then there's other weed pullers that sometimes you have to put it in 2, maybe even 3 times just to get the weed out. Sometimes it comes out without pulling anything at all. I found the Fiskars and Grootpow to be the most consistent. I think this is because the claws for these weed pullers are larger, so it's a little bit easier to go around the center of the weed. They just pulled out the weeds like a champ every single time. Really impressed with these two. Grandpa's weeder, BracNova, also worked really well, but I still think the Fiskars and Grootpow are just my favorite as far as how consistent it would pull out the whole weed every time. And the last thing I tested was effectiveness, and what I mean by this is when you put it in the ground, you put it in just the perfect way. How well is that going to pull out the weed? Again, Fiskars, Grootpow did a fantastic job. The weed puller that struggled the most, I would say, is the Fiskars. Now you can certainly get the whole weed out with this weed puller, but it seemed to take more concentration and you have to get it just in the right spot. Before I show the final scores, let me go over some notes and talk about what I do and don't like about all of these weed pullers. The Fiskars all around fantastic. It's just, it works well, lightweight, easy to pull the weed out, easy to eject the weed. There's really not anything I don't like about the Fiskars. Recently, I helped a neighbor with their yard pulling some weeds. There were some other neighbors that gathered around to help. They all wanted to try out my weed pullers, and universally, everyone said they liked the Fiskars the most. Grootpow is the first weed puller I have used, so maybe I have a bias towards it, but I remember being blown away the first time I used it, how well it works at pulling the weeds out. Now that I've used a bunch of other weed pullers, I have noticed that the Grootpow is a little bit heavier. You kind of have to push the handle over a little bit more to get the weed out, and you have to kind of fiddle with a foot stomper sometimes just to eject the weed. So while I think overall it doesn't work quite as well as the Fiskars, this is another fantastic option. The Grandpa's weeder has a soft place in my heart because I think it's the OG weed puller. I think this is the first one around, and the reason we have so many different varieties of weed pullers, it does a great job pulling weeds out, but it doesn't do a great job getting the weed from the weed puller. So for that reason, it's not my favorite. Still very grateful for that one. The Fiskars, that was kind of just a step down from the Grandpa's weed puller. I like the design. I think it looks nice, and you can have some good success with this. You just have to be a little bit more precise when you use it. And again, it's kind of hard to get the weed out from the weed puller. The BracNova was probably one of the more unique designs, and it actually worked quite well. I don't think it's on the same level as the Grootpow and the Fiskars, but overall it does a great job. It has an ejector. The ejector works great. So overall, super happy with the BracNova. Let's go over the final scores. So no surprise here, the Fiskars got the highest score with a score of 80. This is out of 100. And the Fiskars has the lowest score with 46. Now, one major thing that I didn't talk about is the price for all of these weed pullers. And the reason for that is because prices change, things go on sale. So what I hope this spreadsheet and my test can do is you can decide for yourself which weed puller you think you like, then go to the Amazon listing, see what the current price is, and decide what is best for you. I hope this video helped. Thanks for watching.